Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Gary. How are you?
I'm
Gary?
well. How are you?
I'm good. Where are you
Oh,
today?
I'm in Belfast today. Not no traveling at the moment. Although we're going out to the States pretty soon. We were there in like 8th of November to 10th of December. So yes, groups are slowly starting to come back in here.
You're in Belfast. Lisa and I the other night watched the movie Belfast.
Yeah,
It's
I've
set.
seen it.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
It's set in the '60s, and I wondered how old you were during the Troubles.
Yeah. No, listen, not dissimilar from the age of Kenneth Branagh, who produced the movie. So as a kind of young boy, I remember those scenes well. It was quite strange. James, no, Joyce, my wife, and I watched together just a little while ago. Interestingly, we were in the States. We were staying with friends in Orlando, and they watched it after we went home. And they said, "We really wish you had stayed on another few days to watch this with us to
Yeah.
help explain it."
For those who haven't seen it, it's sort of a coming of age story. This little boy during the tensions in
Yeah.
Belfast and the violence. And I thought about you. I thought, man, he grew up right there.
Yeah.
And you've been at the epicenter of gosh, some of the most amazing things during my lifetime. So tension in Belfast, and then I'm going to Israel in a few weeks here
Okay.
for the Israel-Palestine situation. You've had quite a life, and what we wanted to talk about today for our folks is toxic religion. A lot of us have heard over the past years about toxic charity.
Yeah.
That you can help people in a way that
Upton's book.
it's toxic for them. Toxic religion may be worse. How would you just right off the top of your head define what is toxic religion?
Yeah. I have to think there because I was writing a little about it today there, James, actually for a colleague, and it's almost I often say there's nothing wrong with national identity for you to be American or me to be Irish or British or German or whatever. I think the problem comes about when politics and ethnic national identity really combine together. So national identity as American, Canadian, Brazilian is fine. But when you bring in that ethno identity, I kind of call it, it's like a pyramid of hatred that it starts that my identity is superior to your identity. And then it gradually works its way up. And eventually, I mean, the Holocaust, I guess, is a classic example where it ends in genocide. So, really, as I look back at the Holocaust, I mean, Hitler was not exactly a card carrying Christian by any means, define him sociologically as a Catholic. But he wrote in the second chapter of Mein Kampf, "Today I believe I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator in defending myself against the Jews."
Mm.
So, I mean, as I look at the US at the moment, as I look at my space, as I look at, well, you got Ukraine and Russia at the moment. I mean, Jonathan Sachs talks about linguistic violence in the public space, and many religious actors in your space, and in another generation in my space, and currently at the moment within Ukraine and Russia, religious actors are using volatile language.
Yeah, I mean, that was to me the most appalling thing about what we experienced here on January 6th, 13 months ago now, when they had the invasion of the Capitol. That was just a spooky time period. But these guys wind up on the floor of the House of Representatives, and they had a prayer to Jesus together
Oh yeah, yeah,
while
yeah,
they've got Auschwitz and
yeah,
swastikas and things. So it's just this perversion. I mean, nothing makes people as cynical about religion as the harm that's done. My question, you've dealt with a lot of this. Does the religion create the problem, right? Is it like there's something in the seeds of religion that makes people crazy, wicked, whatever? Or are they just crazy and wicked and the religion is just the best prop that you can come up with? Because like Hitler, you attach God to the outside of something that is really just about power and ego and greed and such. Is the religion the problem, or is religion something that gets latched onto it?
yeah. I don't think it's either or. I think it's more a both and thing. And it was a classic story of that, James. I remember as a kind of little boy being at, I suppose what you would define as a political rally in the early part of our conflict. and leaving it after hearing a couple of pretty volatile, extreme religious speeches. But a number of years later, I met a man called Billy who had been at the same rally. And Billy ended up murdering 2 Catholics during our conflict. And you remember Billy saying to me, you know, Gary, it lit a fire within me. And obviously, as a Methodist, thinking of the heart being strangely warmed. And I said, well, Billy, it most certainly was not the fire of the Holy Spirit. It was the fire of religious sectarianism. Because Billy, as a young man, eventually went out and murdered 2 Catholics. And I suppose, yes, I mean, the Balkans is another classic. The New York journalist David Reef has written this book on praise of forgetting. He tries to deal with memory, and obviously for the two of us as religious leaders, memory is crucial. Why is this night different than any other night?
Wow.
For the Jews, this stood in remembrance of me. But while he was in with a group of Serbs during the early 1990s, he said he left a room and someone put a piece of paper in his hand. He went outside, he looked at it, with some obscure title, date going back to, I don't know, 1490, 1503, maybe the Battle of Constantinople or the Battle of Kosovo, which the Serbs actually lost. But a Serb said to him, you take away the Battle of Kosovo, you take away the soul of the Serbian nation. And 600 years later nearly, that was the justification for the murder of 10,000 Bosnian Muslims, looking back through the corridors of history. So to me, there you see a kind of classic fusion of toxic politics and toxic religion, as I think you've seen in the United States over the last number of years. I think more and more people, thankfully, are now starting to call that out. And I think it's important that people do that. I mean, Christianity Today magazine, you would know, well, pretty mainstream evangelical magazine. I mean, they've started to really deal with this and wrestle with this, and what I call this God is on my side mentality. I mean, you're talking there, just a note here, like in the Senate chamber, you know, a member of the Proud Boys prays this prayer: thank you, Heavenly Father, for being the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us into this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, communists, and the globalists. This is our nation, not theirs. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn.
I mean, I picked up an older book in preparation for today by a guy named Charles Kimball, and it's called When Religion Becomes Evil.
Yeah.
And he charts in there sort of the rise of fundamentalisms in all religions, and that it begins in fear, a terror, the world we've thought was good, that we've treasured, is crumbling. So they're trying to halt the erosion. They're trying to halt the secularism that seems to be the problem. But in trying to get that done, they become, you know, there's an absolutism about it. There's obviously a selectivity, right? If we're going to act this way, we're going to read portions of Scripture, but not all of Scripture, because there's other stuff in Scripture that says, oh, don't do this, right? And then there's just some sort of inerrancy. You know, we're right, that we require blind obedience. The intellect is not engaged any longer. You just do it. You don't ask questions, because if we leave, all good religions leave space for questions, space for conversation, space for reconsideration. But in fundamentalism, all of that breaks down because we're on God's side, right? Say more about it. Is that your sort of your read of what goes on, not just within Christianity, but Judaism, Islam, other religions?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. And it's that, I mean, as I kind of read the Gospels and read the New Testament there, James, I mean, Jesus actually asked more questions than he gave answers. I mean, so if you want to sometimes do a kind of totality of those column counts, Jesus asked more questions than he gave answers, because I think he wanted to wrestle with those. Interestingly, Jonathan Sachs, who quoted there earlier, you know, kind of said, talking about the way Jews read the Bible, maybe us Christians need to hear this. He says, Jews don't read the Bible. We wrestle with the Bible. We struggle with the Bible. We dissect the Bible. I think fundamentalism gives you a ready-made creed, and you can't deviate from that at all. The problem is that with that, when something does go wrong, it's like that kind of infamous house of cards that we would have built up as kids. You pull one of those cards out, the whole thing comes absolutely tumbling down. But psychologically, the impact and the destruction that's had in so many people that have grown up in fundamentalist backgrounds, be that Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, is absolutely earth-shattering. And invariably what happens is they walk away from the thing completely. Whereas I think if you're saying within Christianity, if you and I can leave space for questions, I mean, I've often said quite publicly, James, and I mean, if I ever walk away from Christian faith and you hear, oh, Gary's no longer a Christian, it's not going to be over, did Jesus rise from the dead? Is the Bible the word of God? Creation versus evolution? It'll be over suffering. To me, suffering is an absolute riddle. I've read 101 books on it, theologically, sociologically, psychologically, philosophically. I don't know. I just don't know. I can't explain it. I've heard 101 answers. So if you were to say to me, I live my life at times trusting God in the dark, because having lived through a conflict and, seen babies incinerated in shop buildings, etc., there are no simple answers. It's like Kate Boiler, who you guys would know there at Duke University, young woman struggling with stage 4 bowel cancer, and someone goes to her husband and said, well, this happens for a reason. And her husband says, oh, really? Can you tell me a reason why my 35-year-old beautiful wife has got stage 4 cancer? I don't know. Why can't we have more don't knows in Christianity, James?
Well, and yeah, so toxic religion is a loss of, you could say, a loss of humility, a loss of curiosity, right? I want to know more. I want to know more about the other person, not I have the other person all figured out. Also, there's something, I mean, I think in, some people say that people have too much religion if they become violent. Muslims who are violent, they've got too much Islam. Christians who become violent have too much Christianity. I don't think that's right. I think they have a perverted form, because I think about this book that this guy named David Gushee wrote about who were the righteous Gentiles during World War II, who sheltered at risk to themselves, Jews. And he said, it's not that they were Christian, it's that they were deeply Christian. People that were thinly Christian would never do that in 100 years. But the people that were deeply Christian, when they were interviewed after the war, they could say things like, Mary was Jewish. This is what God asked us to do. That sort of thing. So it's not too much religion, but it's a perverted mode of religion, because the real religion would actually, would make us more peaceful, compatible. I mean, the resources are in the religion that becomes toxic, actually, to bring about the healing.
Yeah, and it's almost just like you were saying there, looking back to the Holocaust again. So if I was to say to your audience tonight, yeah, it's okay to tell lies. People go, James, don't dare bring that man back on your show again. I would say, well, actually it is. So let me tell you one incident where I can tell you as a Methodist pastor, it's okay to lie. It's 1943. You're hiding Jews in your basement. Nazis come to the door. Are you hiding any Jews? No, I'm not. Fundamentalism would preach in the pulpit, never, never, never lie. Really? Well, here's a case where I think it's pretty justified. So these things, it's interesting. There's Jules Isaac, I think it was a French theologian or historian, uses this phrase, which has often stuck with me, James. It's called a teaching of contempt. So if you and I preach in a pulpit, a teaching of contempt about the other, no matter who they are, gradually you begin to demonize them. Again, Abraham Joshua Herschel, who you guys would know much better than me, who welcomed Martin Luther King Jr., he uses the phrase, dehumanization precedes genocide. He always uses the phrase there as well. It was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So as I look at language in the public space in America at the moment, it's appalling. As I look at language in my space at the moment around Brexit, it's appalling. The role of Christian leaders should be to speak words of healing into the public space. And that is perfectly biblical. I mean, you look at the book of Isaiah and divide it into those three spaces. It says, as people of faith, we should be critiquing society. That is the correct thing to do. The problem is, I think, for many of us, James, that we have this sort of what I call sort of like fortress door mentality. We're hiding behind our fortress doors of the church. Let's give Dr. Hall 7 out of 10 for that sermon, or Dr. Mason 7 out of 10, or the choir or the worship band. And all we're doing is simply breeding apathy. The thing concerns me about our theology as Methodists is what has happened to social holiness? What has happened to theology in the public space and in the public square? We've created these like boring, rarefied spaces that just never seem to work. I mean, I was saying some young woman in Atlanta, I think that First United Methodist Church have just created this brilliant space downtown. I actually quoted George MacLeod's poem on the cross. I mean, I have it here, so I'll highlight it. It kind of simply says, I simply argue that the cross be raised again at the center of the marketplace, as well as on the steeple of the church. I'm recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves. On a town garbage heap, at a crossroads so cosmopolitan, they had to write his name and his title, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, at the kind of place where cynics talk smut, thieves curse, soldiers gamble, because that is where he died, and that is what he died about, and that is what Christ's own ought to be, and that is what church people ought to be about. So as you look at your space, James, and I look at my space and other spaces, maybe one of the reasons society is so screwed up is because we've put so much energy into some slick, sexy, highly polished worship service that pleases the masses, but does not bring about societal change.
Yeah, it must feed. There must be some vanity, some vulnerable place in us that the devil, that evil knows it can feed on. I know. In America, two things happen. Yeah, so one is I love to say this. Our idolatry today in America is our political ideology, right? That's what people think. That's the good. And the other people are wicked because they don't buy into that. And then that feeds into this other thing where if I say something, people say, "Now, Pastor, politics and religion don't mix." Keep that out. And that's a code, right? And it's code language for you said something that contradicts my politics. I mean, that's all it's about. It's not that we shouldn't say things about the public issues. So that goes on in America. How do we do better? I think about Arthur Brooks, this guy. He spoke at this National Prayer Breakfast a couple of years ago, and he said we're to be missionaries of hope in the face of contempt. There's just so much contempt out there. I mean, what's the calling for the church now? I mean, you've been in this work of reconciliation. Yeah. Go ahead. How do we go at this? I mean, what is it? It takes time. It takes courage. It takes truth telling. I mean, what's the menu for moving forward?
Yeah. It's interesting, James, tell this story. I'm sure some of your listeners will smile at it as well. I did something for the North Georgia conference there. The joys of COVID, not that there were many, but you're able to get many other conversations. So I think about 150 North Georgia Methodists in a room, just wrestling with some of politics, theology, etc., etc. And somebody says, Gary, you can't name Biden or Trump in the pulpit. It's too risky. What do we do? And I said, well, the first thing I would say is that politics is temporal. The gospel is eternal. So why is it so many people in your space and also in my space are staking their lives on something that is temporal? I mean, I know this, James, and you know this as well as I do. And your listeners know it, even though it may irk them slightly. When the final eschatological curtain falls on planet Earth, I can assure you it will not be Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin that will be standing on that stage. In fact, all of them are going to realize they were simply two-bit actors in a drama produced by another person called Jesus Christ. So why is it in your space, and I've seen it in my space so many times, that temporal politics can supersede the eternal gospel? And trying to answer that pastor's question, James, I did think about it for a week, and I came back. And literally going back to what you were saying earlier, I said this. As I looked at that Capitol building, I was saying to my congregation, I have Republicans in this congregation, and I have Democrats, and I'm glad. I don't want to pastor a congregation of all Republicans or all Democrats. Who wants to do that? I mean, that almost is falsified in itself. But as you said earlier, James, when I looked at that and I saw the cross and a gallows, and I saw people carrying Jesus saves signs, and I also would say this, people have a right to demonstrate in a democracy. Absolutely. Violence, hey, that's another matter. But to see people with Camp Auschwitz t-shirt on, to see people with 6MNJE, which in case people don't know what that means, 6 million Jews were not enough. So people were blazing openly these t-shirts. I'd be saying to my congregation, you've told me your stories about your grandparents. I had an uncle who went in the second day of D-Day, was one of the first into Belsen. Your members of your congregations, parents, grandparents, great aunts, great uncles, they didn't sacrifice their blood on the fields of France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany for people to stand at the Capitol building propagating another Holocaust. So we need to press the pause button and ask, is there something wrong? I think the answer is yes. And I think people need to ask, how have we got to this stage? That's not diminishing those Republicans who were there, who legitimately wanted to protest. But if those kind of people are latching themselves on to a perfectly legitimate political ideology, namely the GOP, people need to say, do we need to reconfigure this somewhat?
Yeah. Tell us a bit about you've done a lot of work in Israel with Israelis, Palestinians. Tell us some about a bit about what goes on there, what were signs of hope.
Yeah.
Talk about that. That seems like one intractable problem to most people.
Yeah, there's no doubt, James. I'm literally just before this, I was speaking to a Jewish colleague in New York City there, having a chat with her. Not the similar conversation as to where I'm going to go now. I mean, it's interesting. In the early 1990s, there were three main conflicts on planet Earth. There were others, but the three biggies, I guess, were South Africa, the Middle East, and the Northern Irish conflict. Most people actually thought with the Oslo Accords that those Israelis and Palestinians are getting over the line. Apartheid was ending in South Africa. And most people looked at the Northern Irish situation and thought it was intractable. I mean, both Winston Churchill, the very famous British bulldog, and Margaret Thatcher, affectionately entitled the Iron Lady, said the Northern Ireland problem was intractable. They were both wrong. And it was interestingly one of the keys to our peace process, and I think people of faith that are listening just in this conversation today, James, need to hear this. We had a political peace process, but with also a social peace process, of which people in the church were actively involved. So they were not leaving it to the politicians. Oslo failed primarily, and any commentator will tell you this today, is because it was seen as a kind of elitist process that had no grassroots ownership. So how do we in the church allow grassroots ownership? I mean, a lot of the work I'm doing, I mean, I've had 1,000, both Palestinians and Israelis in Belfast over the last 10 years, looking at some of the lessons from the Irish peace process. 5 that normally come up are political leadership is essential to achieving peace. Civic society need to be involved in peace building. That as regards security, we found in our case, we only got real security when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict. Fifth thing that often comes up is every Israeli and Palestinian says this to me, Gary, you don't understand. Tell me, what do I not understand? We don't trust each other. And I said, do you really think that when people like me as a clergy person first met with people who were pursuing violence, it was all hugs and kisses? It was anything but it. There was no trust. And I said, trust only evolved in the context of a meaningful relationship. And I think on that, James, I've often said to people in the United States, how are you using sacred space? So we would have met in monasteries, churches, retreat centers, bringing sworn enemies together to listen and try to understand each other. So trust only evolved, I found, and maybe this is a lesson for some people in the United States who to want to bridge the gap, that the widening gap, I guess, between Republicans and Democrats. Is sacred space a place within the United States where religious actors can bring diverse people together to humanize each other? I just suggest that could be a possibility. So the work I'm doing there when people come here and when I spend time there is, New York journalist once said, to disagree well, you need to understand well. Republicans and Democrats in the United States at the moment don't seem even to understand each other. No, they seem unwilling to. So as an outsider looking in, I have to ask the question, why are temporal politics superseding the eternal gospel? Because I know when I'm in my deathbed, trust me, I will not be thinking of Boris Johnson, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump. I'll be asking more eternal questions.
We don't understand one another, or the bigger problem may be we think we do understand one another, right? White people think they know what black people experience and what their problems are. Republicans think they know what's wrong with Democrat, whatever, which is part of the problem. Let me ask you this in closing. You're a Methodist pastor in Ireland. I always think, this may just be me being naive, I always think Methodism has some peculiar special resources to help with this kind of work. So, do you agree with that? And if so, what would you say? What do we have to offer, maybe to help the world?
I've often seen Methodism, James, is what I call it, a bridge building church. We came a little later than the Reformation in a sense. I mean, the Reformation, I'm glad the Reformation happened. Reform is important. I'm not happy with what spilled out of the Reformation. Religious wars. This space is a classic example of that, to put it mildly. As a very young man, I was in the working party. In fact, I was the youngest Protestant in that. I was on a working party in sectarianism, James. Early 1990s. I was only ordained 3 years. I was ordained in 1987. And we very quickly found ourselves back in the 16th and 17th century with three Christian doctrines. One true church, error has no right, and providence. And how a combination of those doctrines were absolutely toxic. If my church is the only true church, then your chances of salvation are diminished at best. But you combine one true church with error has no right. So if my church is the only true church, I mean, it was St. Augustine that brought about the error has no right theology. It's actually my duty to suppress you. So where doctrines were used in our space in an absolutely toxic way, where Methodism spills into this space, I think, is our twin track approach to theology. Maybe evangelical Anglican John Stott died a number of years ago at 92. Brilliant mind. I mean, Stott described Methodist theology as a bird with two wings, but lop off one and the bird crashes. I think Methodism has crashed because we just pursue personal holiness. I'll come back to that in a minute, but we've definitely forgotten about social holiness. But even on that, what is personal holiness? I mean, I had Bishop Will Willem on, who you would know, and will not mind me saying this, but he has that cheeky, caustic, prophetic sense of humor when he's preaching. I mean, I could say that, I know him well. He's preached several times in my church, but Will asked my church, teasingly, I couldn't say it, I'd probably the same. Maybe it's time you went to another church, Gary, but he was only there as the guest preacher. But he said, Gary is not here, sisters and brothers, to meet your needs. So let me say to your congregation, James is not here to meet your needs. If you want somebody to meet your needs, get in Jerry Springer or Oprah Winfrey. That is who you need as a pastor. James's job is to make you holy, personally and in the social space. But we don't want that. We want to feel good about ourselves. That's what we want to do. That is not biblical Christianity.
Gary, that's all beautifully said, and I hate our time's drawn to a close. My question: you were on earlier in the pandemic. I waited too long to get you back. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again
Yes,
sometime.
no, I will. And finally, and not for recording, I was emailing a good friend of yours, you know, Bishop Ken Carter, and I said, "We're doing this today." He says, "Say hi to James. He's a great close friend." So just to let you know that.
Ken preached for us a few weeks back. It was an ice Sunday, so we had to close church and we were totally online. That was fun. I got to be on the screen with him, so it was fun. Gary, thank you so much for joining us, and blessings on you and your work.
Yes, and you too. And listen, we'll get face to face at some stage in the next year, I hope.
I hope so. All right.
Bless you. Best wishes.